Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review the X4 Aileron. This is made by GameSir. Now, by definition, an aileron is one of those flaps that are at the back of a plane's wing. It allows you to control roll. I'm not really sure what that has to do with a Bluetooth controller. I think that GameSir just chose it because it's a pretty cool sounding name. Either way, this controller does have some pretty unique aspects to it, including the fact that it can close down into a very compact size. And the idea is that because it's so compact, you should be able to carry it around more places and then be able to play your phone with a controller in more places as well. And as far as Bluetooth controllers go, it's got some pretty high quality. Not only do the controls feel pretty great, but it has some neat technology, including 2.4 GHz connection between the two sides of the controller. And so this definitely feels more on the premium side when considering GameSir's entire catalog. Another aspect that's premium is the price point. This thing retails for $100, making it by far the most expensive controller from GameSir. And so my main goal with this review is to see whether or not that additional price point is justified, especially compared to cheaper models available from the same company. And as you can imagine, we've got a lot to unpack here, even if it is just a Bluetooth controller review. So grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start with an unboxing, and full disclosure here, this was sent over by GameSir for the purpose of review. But as always, all opinions are my own, and no money was exchanged in any way. Now, one thing you'll notice on the box right away is that it has an Xbox logo. That doesn't mean this is going to work with an Xbox, but rather that it's made with Game Pass in mind. Inside the box, we have our standard fare, which includes an inspection card, a GameSir sticker, as well as a warranty card in case you run into any issues. It also comes with a 1-month trial of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate. We've also got a complete and very long instruction manual. This will give you instructions on how to set up like your hotkeys or to swap out the buttons, things like that. Also inside we have a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. Now the controller itself comes with its own hardshell pack, and it's got the name of the controller right in the front in case you ever forget. Same thing with this strap. If you ever wonder which company made this controller, you've got a constant reminder. Now inside the case, it's pretty impressive. They've actually form-fitted this specifically for the controller. Also on the left side, we have a variety of different accessories so you can change out the look and feel of the controller as well. To start, if you want to reduce the size of your joysticks, they do have some with smaller caps on the top. Additionally, if you like the D-pad design of the Xbox Series controller, they have an option for that as well. It kind of reminds me of the Umbrella Corporation logo from Resident Evil. Then finally, on the bottom, we have 2 additional joysticks, and these are very similar to the ones that come on the device already. The big difference here is that the additional one comes with a concave shape in the center as opposed to convex on the other. It also looks to be just a little bit taller, but not by much. Personally, I like the ones that come on the controller, so that's what I used in all of my testing. Now, first impressions as you're holding the controller is that, yeah, it gets really compact, especially compared to other controllers that you could use with your phone. Let's compare a couple others just really quickly. So first is the Backbone 1. This is probably one of the most compact telescopic controllers you can find, but as you can see, just by nature, it is quite a bit bigger. Same thing if we take my favorite telescopic controller, which is this one here, also made by GameSir. It's called the G8 Galileo. This one feels very sturdy and comfortable, but as you can see, it is quite a bit bigger, even with a phone not in it. And so I think that's probably the main advantage of the X4 right off the bat, is the fact that it gets so compact and small, especially compared to other options on the market. Now let's assess the look and feel of the controller, and right off the bat, you can feel that this does have quite a premium quality to it. For example, the grips on the back have a rubberized texture to them, and are very similar to like an Xbox Series controller, so they feel very professional. In addition, the plastic quality around the rest of the controller feels very nice. It has a bit of a texture to it, it's not very smudgy, and then also it reminds me a lot of a Steam Deck. So I've got no complaints about the overall texture and feel of the controller. I think it's pretty nice. Now the controllers are connected via magnets, and so you can just pull them apart in order to open them up. And inside you can see that they packed in a couple rubber bumpers. Now these are supposed to be used with the controller if you need a little bit extra tightness. So for example, if you're going to be playing it with a phone without a case on it, you would probably want something like this. And of course, we'll test these out here later in the video. Looking at the rest of the controller, it has the same texture on the inside as it does on the outside, so no surprises there. And you can also see the 4 different magnets that they use to connect the controllers to one another. Now technically, you could actually just plop them together like this, but it's not a very strong magnet, and so you wouldn't really want to play it like this at all. Really, the magnets are there so that you can snap them into place the way that they were designed to be. And admittedly, it's a pretty satisfying experience to snap them together like this. Okay, let's take a look at the controls, starting with the leftmost one. So up top we have the analog stick, and this feels great. It has an easy movement to it, a little bit easier to use than say an Xbox or a PlayStation controller. So I do like the light feeling of the stick overall. The shaft on this stick also has a metal coating around it, which feels nice and premium, and the outer ring is made with a palm material, which has a nice gliding feel to it as well. We'll do some more testing with the sticks, but just right off the bat, yeah, these feel great. Next, we'll talk about the D-pad. So this is using a micro switch connection, so it is a little bit clicky, but has a full range of motion. And it is very similar to an Xbox Series controller, so if you like the clicky precision of that controller, you're going to be right at home here. My only observation is that it is a little bit on the loud side, so let's do a quick audio test in an untreated room. So yes, definitely a clicky D-pad. And here's a closer look at the other D-pad option. I personally like the cross-style one, and so I've been using that in all my testing, but I think they both are pretty rounded and are very precise. So overall, yeah, I like the D-pad, and I like the fact that we have two different control options as well. Another thing you may notice is this triangle design here on the left. As far as I can tell, this is only ornamental. It doesn't actually do anything, and you can't actually open it up or anything. Moving on the bottom, we have an Xbox button. This will function as both a power button and an Xbox button when you're using the controller. And then to the left of that, we have our Bluetooth pairing button. On the bottom, we have our USB-C charging port, so let's test this out. And the setup here is pretty simple. You would just plug it in, you'll see an orange ring when it's charging, and if you want to charge the other half of the controller, you would just connect them both, and via the magnets, it'll actually charge it as well. And so I do like the simplicity of this whole setup, but there are a couple caveats to keep in mind. The first is that you cannot charge this thing when actually connected to a phone because both sides of the controller need to be connected at the same time. And in addition, because this is a Bluetooth controller, there's no pass-through charging, so it's not going to charge your phone at the same time as it's charging your controller. So while the charging process is pretty simple, it's important to keep in mind the limitations that we have with this kind of setup. Now on the back, we also have programmable buttons, so let's test these out as well. Once you have a controller connected, it's pretty simple. You're just going to hold onto the M button on the right as well as one of those back buttons. After a moment, you're going to see a white flashing ring around the analog stick, and this means that it's ready now to configure. From there, just press whatever button you want to assign to that back button. In this case, with Halo Reach, I'm going to use the Y button. That allows me to swap between my two weapons by pressing that back button. And that's it. It's a pretty simple setup. Let's do it again with the right side. So we're going to press the M button as well as that right back button for a few moments. And now I'm going to assign it to the A button or the jump button. And there we go. We've now assigned those two back buttons. It's pretty simple to set up, and you obviously can change it on the fly depending on the game that you're playing. Next, we're going to take a look at the shoulders and triggers. Now, the shoulder buttons are a micro switch connection, much like with the D-pad and the face buttons, so it has a light, clicky feel to it. And pressing the button itself is very light and easy, so no problem there. Now, the triggers themselves are analog input, but as far as I can tell, they are not Hall sensor like the analog sticks. Personally, I don't think it's a big deal, especially when it comes to triggers, but if you are looking for a Hall sensor, this is not it. Either way, the trigger itself feels very satisfying. It's a little bit shallow in terms of the range of motion, but I think it's just fine for a mobile controller. And so really, I have no complaints when it comes to the shoulders or the triggers. I think they're very good. Now, one controller function I appreciate is that you can adjust these to be hair trigger if you'd like. And again, we're going to use Halo Reach as our example. So it does take quite a bit of motion to actually get it to zoom in on the sights when using the left trigger. If you want it to be a little bit snappier, you're going to press and hold the M button as well as whatever trigger you'd like to change to be a hair trigger. You're going to see a flash of red around the analog stick, and then after that, yeah, all you have to do is just press it a little bit and it's going to actuate the button. In addition, you'll see the LED button above the Xbox button turn red every time you press it. I think that's to indicate how many sweet headshots you're going to be getting with those hair triggers. Either way, I think it's a pretty simple setup to configure this, and if you want to turn it off, you would just go through the same process. Another thing worth noting are the clamps that they're using to hold the phone in place. I've got a couple notes here. Number one is that I don't like how bright and green they are and they have the big GameSir logo on them. I think it's a little bit gaudy. In addition, they only go so far, so you wouldn't be able to use this with a tablet, for example, which I think is kind of a bummer. And finally, it does have some rubber padding on the bottom to make sure that you don't scratch up your phone when you connect it. Now on the right side, it's very similar other than we have a share button as well as that M function button on the bottom. The only other major difference are going to be the face buttons. Now these also have a micro switch connection to them and are very light to the touch. And because they're micro switches, it does mean that they have a very shallow travel to them. So it's almost like pressing like a Joy-Con button instead. And I don't really mind these buttons at all. I do prefer rubber membranes most of the time, but I do like the fact that they are light to the touch, and then also because they have such a shallow travel to them, it makes them a lot more portable friendly. Another nice feature about these buttons is that on the left side they have a little bit of a flap on them, so you can actually pull them out. They're connected magnetically. And so if you'd like, you can swap out the A, B, and XY pattern on the fly. It's a little hard to get the buttons out in the first place, but after a little bit of practice, it gets pretty easy. Personally, I prefer the Xbox style layout, so we're just going to stick with that. Let's also do an audio test of these buttons. So overall, yeah, they are clicky buttons, but not as loud as the D-pad, so I think they're just about right. Now, connecting the controller to your phone is actually a pretty simple process. All you have to do is just slide them into the clamps, and when you pull the clamps up, it's automatically going to turn the controller on. From there, each of the two sides are going to connect to one another via that 2.4 gigahertz connection. After that, all you have to do is just go into the Bluetooth settings of your phone and then pair it with the controller, and you should be good to go. And after that, any time that you connect the phone to the controller, it's just going to automatically pair, so it's a pretty seamless experience. Now in this next section, I did a bunch of testing and different results, so we're kind of going to go back and forth between my impressions as I'm using it and then also other observations. And right off the bat, first thing I noticed when trying to test a game is that yes, these analog sticks feel great. Even when playing a game like Wipeout Pulse, which I am just notoriously bad at, it actually made me feel pretty good in this game. The sticks feel really precise and responsive, but then also super smooth and gliding, and so it's just a really excellent combination. And the fact that I picked up on it the moment I started playing with this controller, I think is an excellent sign. These are some of the best sticks I've ever found in a mobile controller. Now, another thing I noticed right off the bat is that the phone itself didn't feel very sturdy within the controller. In fact, it feels pretty wobbly as you move it around, and I think this is kind of typical for this type of controller when there's two different parts. Either way, it definitely doesn't make me feel like it's a very sturdy setup, but bear in mind also that my phone doesn't have a case on it. So let's try out some of those rubber bumpers, and these are meant to press the phone closer to the clamp so it's a little bit of a tighter fit. And sure enough, yes, when putting the bumpers on, it does feel more secure. Not by much, but a little bit tighter. And so I think when trying to bend it front and back, yes, you're going to need either a case or a rubber bumper like this. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that the clamp itself is not super tight. If we try to twist this at an angle, you can see that the phone will pop right out. Now, I'm not sure how often you're going to be squeezing and moving the phone around as you're playing it. You know, I tend to hold these pretty lightly in the hand. But all the same, it doesn't leave me with a very sturdy feeling when I'm actually holding the controller. By contrast, if we use a telescopic controller, this just feels absolutely more sturdy. Not only do the springs in the mechanism hold it a lot tighter, but then also because it's plugged in via USB-C, it just feels like it's actually connected to the controller as opposed to just slapped on top. And so if you do want a more sturdy feeling, I would recommend a telescopic controller. This actually feels like a full cohesive unit as opposed to the other one. But also bear in mind that the G8 Galileo, my favorite telescopic controller, the one we're using right here, it's a little bit wider than the other ones. Let's do a quick measurement between them to see just how large this can get. For this test, I'm using the LG V60. This is my standard phone. It's about the size of any larger phone that's available on the market right now. And you can see that with the X4 we're reviewing today, it's about 10 inches with the controller attached. That's about the same as it is on another GameSir mobile controller. This is the X2S, another one I've reviewed previously. Again, 10 inches. The only one I could find that's a little bit smaller is the Backbone 1. This one is just under 10 inches, but not by much. By contrast, yes, the G8 Galileo is bigger and roomier. This one is almost 11 inches, so almost a full inch longer than the others. But if you ask me, the G8 is the most comfortable among all of these as well. Now, in terms of weight, this is 191 grams. That makes it about 60 grams lighter than the G8 Galileo, but it's also about 50 grams heavier than the Backbone 1 and 20 grams heavier than the X2S. But I think that makes sense given the fact that the X4 is a battery-powered controller. It has two different 400 mAh batteries inside. Now, as we're also talking about size and weight, let's also talk about portability. After all, I think that's one of the major draws of the X4 Aileron, is that it can get so compact. However, from a travel perspective, I would say that it doesn't get super compact. It's still a pretty big controller. For example, it's not something that you could just throw in your pocket and take around with you. It's definitely an accessory you know you're going to have on you when you carry it around. And I think it gets exacerbated even more if you try to use that case. In fact, the case itself is rather large. As I was holding it, I kept thinking to myself that I might as well just bring an Xbox controller at this point, because a full-on Xbox Series controller is still smaller than the X4 when it's in its case. And so even though, yes, it does get a little bit more compact, I wouldn't say it's like a huge difference between the two. Especially if you're going to factor in that additional case, by then the difference between the two gets really small. Another thing I kept coming back to as I was testing the controller is that Yes, even though it does get compact, it feels like there's quite a few compromises when actually using it. The first is that the gaming experience also feels fairly compact. It's not going to be a full-size controller experience like the GameSir G8. In addition, it doesn't feel very sturdy or cohesive. Instead of actually feeling like you're transforming your phone into a gaming console, it really just feels like you're slapping on two controllers on each side of a phone. Meanwhile, it's kind of an opposite experience with the GameSir G8 in that it does feel cohesive and a lot more comfortable. In fact, this is the one controller I've mentioned that doesn't feel like a compromise when you're using it with a phone. So if I had to pick between the two in terms of just the ergonomics and comfort and just the overall feel of it as a handheld device, I would pick the GameSir G8 every single time. Next, let's do a couple more tests. We're going to start with a phone that actually has a case on it. And as expected, you can't use the rubber bumpers and a case at the same time. So in order to test this, I did have to pull off the rubber bumpers, which is kind of a bummer because that means that the next time I try to stick these on, they're going to be less sticky. It's definitely not something you'd want to swap back and forth every time. You're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to play it with a case or without? And just to confirm, even with a case, it still has that wobbly and not very sturdy feeling to it overall. Now, all the marketing materials from GameSir says this only works with Android, but just to be sure, I did test it with my iPhone. The controller will connect via Bluetooth, but I found that once connected, it actually won't give any controller input at all on my phone. And I couldn't find a single app that actually worked, and that included emulators as well as native apps. None of these would actually detect the controller at all. So I think it is getting connected, but just not recognizing it as an actual external controller. And I think that's also a bummer because there are a lot of iPhone users who would probably benefit from having a controller like this. Next, I wanted to test the input lag because this is a Bluetooth controller. And I'm running this with no run ahead on or anything, and yeah, it still feels great. I'm not the best judge of input lag, but at least for me, I can't really tell a difference between this and something that's actually physically hooked up. However, one thing of note is that the analog stick does get a little bit in the way when you're using the face buttons, and so this is a pretty easy fix. You can just pull the analog stick off and then it'll be fine. So overall, I think this is going to be pretty good when it comes to emulation and input lag. It's just going to be your typical phone experience. It's also a very similar experience when it comes to game streaming. I tested out both Xbox and PlayStation and they worked fine, just the same as any other Bluetooth controller when connected to these streaming apps. So again, I didn't detect any input lag from the controller itself. It all has to do with just the inherent lag that comes when using streaming. Another reminder that I had when playing streaming games in particular was just how good these analog sticks really are. I think it really comes to a forefront when playing a modern game. It feels very smooth. In fact, I think it's a superior experience to the analog sticks on the GameSir G8, which I always thought were pretty good anyway. It definitely makes me wish that we had those sticks on the G8, because I think it would elevate it even more. Especially when you consider that I think all of the other buttons on the G8 are superior to the X4. So overall, when it comes to gameplay with the X4 Aileron, I think it's a pretty solid controller. There are some things that are exceptional, including the sticks, but there are some compromises, like the fact that it feels a little bit wobbly, and it's not quite as roomy as something like the GameSir G8. Okay, before wrapping up, I have a couple other notes. Like I mentioned before, if you pull up the clamp, that's going to turn on the controller, but you don't necessarily have to use the clamp to turn on the controller in the first place. Instead, what you can do is press and hold the Xbox button for about 5 seconds and the controller will turn on its own. So it is possible to pair this controller with a phone without having to actually physically connect it. In order to connect the right side, you have to do the same thing, but hold onto the share button instead. Again, just wait about 5 seconds and this will also connect and then also connect to the other controller. So if you'd like to use these kind of like de facto Joy-Con controllers that have been disconnected from the Switch, you can definitely do that. However, in my own testing, I didn't really like this setup. I did prefer to connect it directly to the phone. A couple other things we can do with the M button is we can hold onto it and press up and down on the analog stick. This is going to increase and decrease the RGB lighting around the sticks. In addition, if we flick it left and right while holding the M button, we can try different color patterns as well. For example, there's one that will just cycle through solid colors as opposed to the rainbow one that's on by default. And personally, I like the default one, so I've been using that instead, but you do have a range of options here. You can also hold onto the M button and press up and down on the D-pad to adjust the volume, which I think is handy as opposed to reaching for the physical keys. And then finally, one last note is that this Xbox button will function fully with the Xbox app, so when you press on it, it is going to act like an Xbox button, which I think is pretty handy. Usually with a lot of these controllers, you have to physically tap on the screen and then pull up the Xbox button physically, and so it's nice that you don't have to do that here. Now there's also a GameSir app on the Play Store. This will allow you to update the firmware. It's pretty easy. And then also you can see the battery life remaining on the controllers right then and there. You also have a gamepad tester option, so if you want to make sure all your buttons are working, you can check them here. And you can make some slight adjustments to the keys, including switching between the Switch and Xbox layout, and then also adjusting those back buttons as well. You can also adjust these just using hotkeys, but it's always nice to see these too. And then finally we have a joystick settings section. This will allow us to adjust the dead zone, but then also invert the axes too. So we do have a few options when it comes to adjusting the controls, but the app itself is pretty bare bones. Okay, so that's really it when it comes to all my testing. Let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the X4 Aileron. As always, we'll start with what I like, and there are quite a few things here. To start, I like the fact that it gets compact. It doesn't get like super small compared to other controllers, but it still feels really solid when you have it snapped together. In fact, the controller itself feels the most solid when you have it compact like this, but we'll talk about that more in the next section. I also think the controller itself has an overall high quality feel to it, especially the rubber bumpers on the back. And far and away, I think the sticks are the highlight of this controller. I hope that they use sticks like this in their future products. The face buttons themselves are pretty decent. They are micro switch, but they're the good kind of micro switch, so I like that. Now, I didn't do a full exhaustive battery life test here with these controllers, but given the fact that they are each 400 milliamp hours, I would expect about 18 hours of battery life altogether. I will say that over my 3 or 4 days of testing, I didn't need to charge the controller at all, and I still had about 50% battery life when I was done. When it comes to connecting this controller to your phone as well as to both sides of the controller, it's very easy once you have it set up, so I do like that as well. Additionally, I like the fact that GameSir really leans into the customizable aspect of this controller. They offer a variety of sticks and D-pads to be able to swap them out to suit your needs, and I love the fact that you can physically swap out the A, B, and XY pattern on your face buttons too. However, even though there are a lot of things to like about this controller, there are just as many negatives to it as well. And I think right off the bat, the number one thing for me is the fact that when actually connecting this to your phone, it doesn't feel very secure. And for me, this is kind of a make or break feature. Now, when actually using it, I don't feel like the phone is going to slip out of the controller, but it definitely is more likely to do so compared to other options. And that tiny little difference does mean a lot to me, especially when I have other choices out there. I'm also not a huge fan of the controller's design, specifically when you have it connected to a phone. I understand that they needed to have clamps in here to secure the phone to the controller, but did it need to be bright green and have GameSir on it? It almost feels like advertising while I'm playing the device, and it was something that I just really couldn't easily ignore. I think if these two clamps were just solid black, it would be a much better visual experience. Another negative for me is the price point. This thing is $100 retail, which is quite a bit more expensive than other options that they have on the market. And I think if this controller really knocked it out of the park, then yeah, I could see that added expense, but there are quite a few shortcomings still to go. The first is that this controller will not work with tablets. It has almost all the building blocks there, but the fact that these clamps only go so high means that it's not actually going to work. Additionally, for being a $100 controller, it's pretty weird that it doesn't have any iPhone support at all. I understand that it probably required an additional Bluetooth protocol, and that probably was expensive to get that license, but we're also talking about a controller that cost $100, and there are a lot of iPhone users who could benefit from having a controller like this. Also, by nature of being a Bluetooth controller, it lacks some inherent features like a 3.5mm headphone jack as well as pass-through charging. And there's no real getting around it with the Bluetooth controller, but when compared to other options on the market, it does feel like those features are lacking. And I think that when you put these all together, it's a controller that overall feels worse than other options from GameSir. Now, I have no insights into the design of this controller, but it feels like to me, just holding the finished product, is that the designer came up with an idea, and that was to make a compact controller, and then they just tried to make everything else work, and unfortunately, I don't think they really got there. To me, it almost feels like GameSir took all the lessons they've learned over the years from their telescopic controllers and threw it out of the window in favor of a Bluetooth controller that actually is pretty complicated when it should be pretty simple. And the end result is that we're left with a controller that costs more, but somehow also feels cheaper and more gimmicky. And when it comes down to it, I think that its main feature, the fact that it gets so compact, also has to face the ugly reality that none of these controllers are very compact, even this one. I think that every controller on the market is never going to feel compact to the point where it doesn't feel like an extra burden to carry it around. And so I think that instead of focusing on things that aren't going to make a tangible difference, it's better to improve upon the features that really matter. And if we put it all together and compare the X4 Aileron against all the other good controllers we have on the market, it feels like it's only an upgrade in two different ways. The first is that it has an upgraded price, given the fact that it's $20 more than the most expensive telescopic controller that they have. And then yes, it also has some really nice and upgraded analog sticks. And my biggest takeaway after reviewing this controller for the past 3 or 4 days is that I just wish that we had these sticks on the GameSir G8. Because for all the reasons that we've talked about throughout the video, if I had to choose between these two, I would still pick the G8 every time. For my part, I appreciate that it gets compact, but I don't think it gets compact enough to make up for its shortcomings compared to other devices within the GameSir catalog. So as far as I'm concerned, the GameSir G8 Galileo is still the king when it comes to phone controllers, although the X4 did have a valiant try. Now all we need to do is see these sticks in the G8, and we're going to have the perfect controller at that point. Anyway, that's about it for this surprisingly long controller video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to be picking up the X4 Aileron, or do you think the other recommendations are better? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.